Thank you so much. It's already been a fascinating symposium. I've been taking notes as fast as my hand will allow. So we have so much to discuss, and I really appreciate RIETI and ANU putting together a symposium that doesn't try to sugarcoat or hide the challenges that we face in the global economy, but really tries to tackle them in all their difficulty. So my job tonight was to think about the US side, and in particular to discuss some of the US positions and constraints and how other countries might begin to deal with these constraints. Okay, so I think we've all, in one way or another, admitted that multilateralism is in crisis. The WTO is unable to negotiate new rules at the current time. Dispute settlement is often voided because of the lack of an appellate body mechanism at the current time. US and China have been unable to reduce trade and technology tensions, even though we saw a halt or pause in the US-China tariff war. We know that there are continues to be tensions in many areas, and in some ways, they're intensifying. The US currently seems unlikely to engage on issues of economic importance to countries in Asia, especially further liberalization. Now, we're going to learn more in the coming weeks as we see the US provide some details on the Indo-Pacific economic framework. But I think we all know that as our two secretaries, Secretary Tai, USTR Catherine Tai, and then Secretary Raimondo, our Secretary of Commerce, have made clear this will not be including any new liberalization or new market access. So the question became then, what will it be? How deep will it be? China is seeking deeper engagement, particularly entry into the CPTPP, excuse me, but the terms of exchange are unclear. It has taken the approach that it will look for the negotiations to provide information on where it needs to increase its capacity to meet existing rules. As we have heard from previous speakers, sorry, I don't know why that's happening. That means that, excuse me, as we've heard from previous speakers, there's an importance to maintaining the high standards that are embodied in the agreement and to not have them be watered down through accession agreements. So this will be something that we'll all be watching very carefully. Having said that, as Professor Armstrong said, there's a real opportunity here to enmesh one of the two big partners, China, in a high quality agreement. And that is something that I think I agree with him, we all should welcome. Now, focusing just on US-China economic tensions, which reflect the theme of today's session, which has to do with major power competition. I think there's three major drivers: anxiety about technological dominance by the other. This is often sort of cloaked in the idea of economic security, but it goes beyond that. It has to do with the fact that we are in the middle of another technological revolution, and that there are going to be very large gains to those who come out at the top on the competition. Secondly is concerns over industrial supply chain security. That is certainly something that was heightened by COVID-19. And third is the belief that the other is willing to weaponize trade and investment. Again, we've seen that this is possible in ways that we probably wouldn't have thought were possible even 7 or 8 years ago. So these challenges all intersect with one another, and they reinforce each other, and they limit opportunities or options for further integration and liberalization by the US president. First, anxiety about technological dominance. As I said, we're on the cusp of great technological change. We know that these technologies come with what economists call very large economies of scale. So there will be a small number of competitors who will dominate standards, sit at the center of supply chains, and reap very large rewards. That economic competition is overlaid with the fact that the new technology has many important implications for national security. And so that national security purpose begins to add new urgency to winning this competition. So the US and China see the need to meet growth and distributional challenges in their own economy. And they see this technological competition as the key to meeting those challenges, as well as national security challenges. The second is supply chain security concerns. The concerns were clearly exacerbated by the pandemic shortage and the need to ration some materials. Here in the US, it really centered on the need for personal protective equipment. It demonstrated, I think, for policymakers the political risks and economic costs of supply chain disruption, and led to demand from citizens for remedial activity. Something has to be done about this. We can't be this vulnerable. These vulnerabilities are clearly linked with national security in multiple ways, and they demand that key technologies be produced at home, that key technologies not be vulnerable to supply disruptions in other countries, and that key technologies not be open to technology theft. So this leads to strong domestic support for de-integration, so-called reshoring or nearshoring, or even what Commerce Secretary Raimondo at a speech at the Peterson Institute called friendshoring. This goes back to some of the concerns that Professor Armstrong mentioned about creating a trusted network of like-minded to the exclusion of openness and the possibility of multilateralizing. The third concern is weaponized trade and investment. And yes, as Professor Armstrong clearly said, the US is weaponized trade and investment, even though I have to say that's not something that we discuss very openly here in Washington. Section 301 tariffs, the new Competes Act from the US House, which will provide some provisions to, for outward investment review. Of course, that's just the House part. That legislation has to be reconciled with the Senate bill, so this is not law yet, but it shows where people are going in terms of worrying about not just trade, but also outward investment. And an increasing reliance by the United States on financial and trade sanctions to address many non-trade issues. We also know that China has clearly weaponized trade and investment, and Professor Armstrong had some very interesting graphs on the Australian experience, of which there's also other examples. So the result of all this is a very low trust environment for US-China negotiations. And it makes any kind of progress, not only between the two countries, but also at the WTO and in other fora, very difficult. So what are the scenarios? One that's discussed here is partial decoupling. And the problem there is very clear, and it was also pointed out by Professor Armstrong, which is that the US cannot decouple from China without decoupling from Asia. Decoupling from Asia is something clearly that the US has said it doesn't want to do, and is trying to move forward with the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum to address. But it makes it very difficult to kind of walk this tightrope of reducing reliance on China while increasing its reliance on Asian partners. If we look at, for example, RCEP trade with other RCEP countries, it's almost 50% of RCEP trade goes to other RCEP countries. The Asian networks are deeply intertwined, and it's not really possible to take those strands and unwind them and reconnect them in ways without enormous cost and disruption. Scenario 2 is clubs and trusted networks, and the question quickly arises of whether this is consistent with the multilateral system. The EU approach has been to say, yes, that open clubs like climate clubs, which it has pushed, can push the multilateral agenda forward. The open agreements can provide an incentive for countries to prepare for and adopt higher standards. But then the question comes is, how is that going to be docked inside the WTO. Others, like the United States, really don't talk so much about open clubs because, in fact, we don't want everybody in our club. It's the US approach would be to do business with trusted suppliers or realign supply chains by friendshoring. Agreements may appear open, but I think many of our trading partners would see them as actually closed. The third scenario, and one which I think is where we are right now, is to try to limit the damage that's being done until we get a clearer idea of where these various pieces are going to sort out. The problem is that events may be overtaking the patience that many of US trading partners have shown so far. We see both the US and China moving forward with plans to secure their supply chains. Attempts to identify their vulnerabilities and diversify import sources and export destinations. And in regional negotiations, seeking to minimize, I think it would be wise to minimize complexity and diversity of new rulemaking as a way to try to move toward the type of multilateralism that we all desire. Lastly, I think it would be wise to be open to integration opportunities, as Japan clearly is, even if they're smaller or with a narrower set of partners than desired. And the idea there is to make sure that these agreements are open and lead to allow for strategic re-engagement in a multilateral setting. So I'll close by saying that the road ahead is rocky. The world trading system will likely limp along, and that may be the best we can expect. I wish that we had better news to offer from this side of the Pacific. The US-China tech decoupling has the potential to tear apart global value chains if it isn't well managed, and to really disrupt established trade relations across Asia that feed into US markets. So that's a very high stakes in this current situation. Here, limiting the damage of the current tensions may be the best option among those currently available. And I think that that alone is a very serious challenge for our policymakers and our diplomats. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As we know, the global trade is walking towards a multipolar global power. We have listened to the US and Australia have responded to these changes. Now we will discuss how ASEAN positions itself and its role in global trade. ASEAN consists of the 10 Southeast Asian countries. So how ASEAN's in the global trade? East Asia, including ASEAN, are among countries that achieve high economic growth based on its trade and investments. And ASEAN has been very active in promoting trade and investments, as well as forming the trade agreements to facilitate this. ASEAN has formed the ASEAN Free Trade Area, or AFTA, in 1992, and ASEAN +1 FTAs with its main trading partners, mostly concluded in 2020. Recently, ASEAN, with its 5 main trading partners, concluded the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, or RCEP. The RCEP has come into effect on the 1st January this year, as it has already reached the quorum of 11 member countries ratified the RCEPs. The RCEP is the largest economic bloc in the world. Even without India in 2021, the countries in the RCEPs accounts for 31% of the world's populations, 31% of global GDP, 27% of global trade, and 33% of foreign direct investments. By comparisons, the Trans-Pacific Partnerships, or TPP, now without the US, so-called the CPTPP, represents only 7% of the world's populations, 13% of global GDP, 15% of trade, and 20% of FDI. So we can see how big the RCEP is compared to other regional trading blocs. Next. Now there are so many questions for ASEAN. Will ASEAN join the CPTPP? I can see like it will be less likely for ASEAN countries to join CPTPP in the absence of the US. Because at least there are three main reasons why ASEANs feel less likely to join the CPTPP without the US. One is economic reasons. There has been, or we have to do high adjustment costs for relatively smaller benefits than the RCEPs if we are joining the CPTPP. Second, domestic political economy. The CPTPP contains more ambitious provisions that require broader, deeper, shorter time for adjustments in domestic laws, such as in SOEs, IPR, competitions policy, and labor and environmental standards. Last, the good things about the RCEP is that even though it doesn't call for liberalizations at the same level of the CPTPP, its impact on the economy's member countries and indeed on the world economy will be massive. The RCEP will intensify supply chains in the regions while also being very sensitive to political conditions and level of developments of member countries. So the ASEAN's current top priorities are the implementations of the RCEP and ASEAN-EU, either bilaterally or as a unified ASEAN. Next, it's always the case that which side should we stand for? Should we stand for China or the US? I think, of course, neither of them. The prolonged US-China trade and now technology tensions will only increase uncertainties that will be translated into costs for everyone. Of course, like we can see, while the US increased tariff rates on Chinese products aiming to block imports from China, but the results show that the other way around. In 2021, the US recorded $397 billion of trade deficits in goods with China and 1.08 trillion to the world, the largest ever trade deficit the US has ever recorded. It's the same when the Chinese try to put ban on Australians' exports, most of Australians' exports other than iron ore. It's resulting in the increase in iron ore prices, leading to overall increase of 10% of Australians' exports. So I think by this time, both the US and China have already learned something by now, even though they don't listen to trade economists, but they have already earned the results of what they're doing, resulting costs, increasing costs everywhere and diversing trade market around the world. Next, all in all, I think like the US-China tensions further intensify the urgency of strengthening the rule-based multilateral trading systems. What we can do is that I think probably the US will not gonna listen to small powers, but I think the US will at least listen to Australia and Japan. First things first, I think it's important for us not to entangle issues. So we should not tangle issue one to another. I think it's very important to strengthen the multilateral trading systems, particularly on the dispute settlement body. I really hope that Australia and Japan can seriously push the US to settle these issues. And then the second one, I fully support on what's going on right now in terms of plurilateral agreements mechanisms. I think that's one way that we can pursue right now. But I just want to remind everyone that while FTAs can be a stopgap solutions, there will be no substitutes for a well-functioning multilateral trading systems. I think I will talk more on the G20 in the discussions. Thank you.
The first one is just mentioned by the previous speakers and sharers about the regional new rules in the Asian Pacific. is very important because Asian Pacific is the most dynamic regions in terms of development. For example, since the World War II, we know that first the Japanese economy is rising, and also second one is Asian needs, and then follow up by China and ASEAN and also others. So this regions is very dynamic in terms of development. Also in terms of trade and investment, it's the most open economy, and also especially before the 1980s, when other regions follow the export-oriented strategies. Before that, Asian needs and also Japan's already opened their economy for a long time, so for 20 years or even more. Now also a lot of the trade among these regions is very deep, and even without some of the official arrangement. And another one is that since World War II, so we know that in these regions there is 13 or even more high growth, fast growth economy in these regions. And so this is very important. If we have some new rules, we can test in these dynamic regions. And another point is that for China, from a Chinese perspective, is that China's applications for CPTPP membership, and I think is one part of the overall strategies of Chinese development, especially more open up to the outside world. The reason for that is because next slide, please. The reason for that is the Chinese economy is deeply integrated with Asian Pacific regions. For example, in the last years, in terms of the export, and more than 20% of Chinese export among the East Asian economy, and another 20% with NAFTA, and also with the ASEAN, EU's is something like 15% in terms of export. In terms of import, yes, it's also more from East Asians and from ASEAN. And if we look at the import and export together, we can see more integrated with the East Asian economy, and with the NAFTA, ASEAN, and EU is something more balanced, is something 15%. And so this region is the most important trade partner for China. And the next one, please. And also, when China's open up to the outside world, China is first integrated with the neighborhood economy, first with Japan's, with Asian needs, and then becomes the regional hubs of manufacturing. We attract a lot of investment from neighborhood economies, and becomes the regional manufacture centers, and also export more goods, import something from neighborhood in terms of components and parts, and export these goods to all over the world, for example, to US market, to EU market, and to ASEAN market as well. So this is the reasons for that. Another one is that just as mentioned by previous speakers, for example, from Syracuse and Maris, about the competition between United States and China. And the regional platform is the most important for China and the United States to beyond the bilateral engagement. We can have, maybe, for example, we can have regional solutions for the trade agreement. For example, for the RCEPs, we have agreement with Japan's, and Japan and Korea also have regional agreement with Korea. So even it is very difficult for the bilateral free trade agreement between China and between Japan and Korea. But on the regional platform, it's possible. And I think this is also a very good idea for the regional platform to go through some of the challenges for the bilateral issues. And the last one is that more Chinese integrated with these regions, and also in the past we import components and parts and export something, and in the future we import more labor intensive goods from also these regions, and also some of the energies and materials from these regions as well. So this is second point. Next, please. And the third point is that I think China's application for CPTPP is very seriously and also very patient for this membership. And China's for this membership is not only to like somebody maybe comments for this applications. Maybe China want to take advantage of this rules, and also maybe have some unfair practice. So that. But my point is that China's application for CPTPP is that China want to contribute something, because the CPTPP application processing is also the bilateral market opening processes. And on the one hand, China wants to join. On the other hand, China must too comply with these rules. Just as Mary mentioned, this high standard rules. China's application for that means we want to fully comply with these rules as well. And so, the last point is that that's most important is that we hope other members, especially from Japan, Australia, to have long visions for this membership. And from United side, from US side, and we even it's difficult for China and the United States to bilateral engagement, and we know that we still have some strategic competitions. Just mentioned from Mary's and also Cheryl's for that. But for these regions, my opinion is that we must have cooperations, especially in the regional platform, and Australia and Japan must play very important roles between this competition between China and the United States. If we cannot find a solution in these regions and in the regional platforms, it's very difficult for China and the United States bilaterally to have some solutions. And for this issues, most important that I agree with Cheryl's think that is firstly is not the like-minded ideas for the regional agreement or some of the friend shores clubs for these corporations. It's must open-minded for the regional cooperation and also for the multilateral rules. Otherwise, it's difficult to find the solutions for these competitions and also for the regional new rules. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I, as the eternal optimist, all of what's been said previously by my esteemed panelists, it's been so thought-provoking. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. But what I wanted to sort of wrap up some of these presentations with was firstly setting out what some of these digital trade rules, what they're enabling, the benefits that we're seeing. Then really looking at where we can see some of those key areas that we need to prioritize in our digital trade rules or the guidelines that are being put in place. And then lastly, sort of bring that all together into some of those like next steps that we would like to see for the region. So first of all, when we look at the digital trade rules that are being put in place, they're really whether they're being like as in the digital trade provisions that are in like free trade agreements or some of the specific digital trade agreements that are being put in place, I think there are three things that we can see that are happening. So first of all, they're really enabling interoperability. So whether we look at CPTPP or RCEP or the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement or deeper between Chile, New Zealand and Singapore, what these provisions are really doing is enabling different systems to be able to talk to each other. So whether that's a personal data protection framework or customs procedures that are different in different economies, these rules and provisions are enabling these to talk to each other. We also, they're facilitating digital trade. So they're removing a whole host of barriers, whether this is minimizing some of the cross-border data flow restrictions or removing some of those localization requirements, some of the customs duties on digital products or that disclosure of source code, that lack of access to effective dispute resolution mechanisms. A lot of these provisions that are being put in place are facilitating digital trade and really like enabling it. And the other thing that these rules are doing is almost acting as building blocks. So both, and this is happening in two ways. So the first one is really that, so if you have a look at deeper, each of those modules in this digital trade agreement are almost building blocks in themselves, in that as other members are able to join them, you have those rules being scaled across the region. The other thing we're seeing is then building blocks in terms of some of that sectorial enablement. So if we have a look at the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement, it's a little bit unique in that often the financial sector is the traditional carve out for what we're seeing in some of these rules and some of that cross-border data flow enablement, the flows being able to happen. But what the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement is looking to do, it's actually included a lot of the financial services there. So it's addressed that through explicit provisions. So we can start to see how these commitments that are being put in place are really offering a path forward for the economies that are joining. Before we sort of get into the discussion too, I always find it helpful that we're coming from talking about digital trade from a common understanding. So we, in a lot of the research work that we've been doing, have developed a methodology that we've been applying. So this breaks out digital trade into 4 buckets. So the first 2 buckets are often what we think of when we talk about digital trade. So the first one is digital goods and services delivered by the internet or like in electronic format. So this is often the Zoom platform that we're meeting on here today or watching this being live streamed on YouTube. It's a lot of those cloud tools and solutions that we've all been forced to use as we're working and learning from home over the past couple of years of the pandemic. That's what we're sort of putting into that first bucket. Then the second bucket is that digital delivery of tangible goods and services. So these are things that we're buying online. So often when I'm making presentations, my buzzer goes off because someone's delivering an e-commerce product that I've bought online, or it's food that I've ordered on an app that is then being delivered in person and I'm consuming it in person. So this is where we've got those first 2 buckets. This is not an exact science, like as in things fall into different buckets, but it's helpful to try and separate this out to understand what we're talking about. This third bucket includes often the invisible parts of digital trade, but it's really enabling it. This is both the hard and soft infrastructure that is in place, so like the actual connectivity, so we're able to conduct digital trade, but it's also the policies and regulations that are put in place to facilitate that. So things like foundational frameworks, like data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, the bits and pieces that put together to enable digital identity to happen so we can authenticate these transactions. And then the last bucket that we have is an emerging technologies bucket. And the reason why we've separated that out this is because these technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, or 3D printing are really changing the scale and the speed and the scope of digital trade. And then what we've been doing is once you sort of have these buckets, you're able to sort of look at what's happening inside the domestic digital economy to try and see where we're having those digital trade potential and growth. So and as you look at this, these numbers are huge across ASEAN. I would flag that often, as good as these numbers are, they are still very conservative. And I'll come back to that measurement issue at the end. But what we sort of do is have a look at those 4 buckets, and then we sort of measure it out in terms of where an economy is at in each of those buckets. And then we can see that, so we've gone from 2018 to then projected that growth to 2025. And you can really see that then by focusing on some of those key digital trade provisions, or leveraging things like international standards in some of those key areas, that growth here is still really conservative. And you can see that it's going to exponential across the region. The other thing that looking at this, looking at digital trade in this way, is we're able to identify some key sectors across ASEAN that really are being digitalized and that we can further accelerate or enable. And both by looking at some of the provisions in these digital trade agreements that are popping up, as well as then when we look at some of the priorities that ASEAN and APEC are focusing on, I think that 3 priority areas really stand out in terms of how we're able to further accelerate digital trade across the region. This is really looking at enabling safe and secure, seamless digital transactions, then facilitating digital logistics and delivery, and then underpinning all of that is digital trust. So I'm going to dive into a few of these sections. So the first one is really digital payments. So we know, so digital payments is they include everything from making online payments. So whether that's you're paying for online groceries, or you're receiving a government disbursement or a grant, you're borrowing money, you're paying and receiving from goods that you've ordered from overseas. But it also includes things like a broad range of digital financial services here. So whether that's trade finance, lending, insurance, or currency exchange. And what we're seeing, these digital payment transactions are like an integral foundation, like a core enabler of digital trade. And we know that using digital payment transactions, the wider that they're available, and this use of this cross-border digital transactions will further facilitate international trade. So you can see here we've projected this across ASEAN here as well. So as in by bucketing this out into different facets that make up digital payment transactions, we've got this huge growth over 2021 and then to 2025. That's 19% growth. And this is just looking at ASEAN. And again, these are limited numbers because we don't have data for every ASEAN member state. But for this growth to be further improved or accelerated, we need to have interoperability and that interlinking of electronic payment systems and infrastructures. And the way that this happens is often leveraging international standards. So whether this is ISO 222, so that payment messaging standard, it's leveraging the QR code standards, the EMB code part, or even the open banking, using open APIs. And we're seeing this progressively being picked up by some of these digital trade agreements. Useful to have a look at is almost like the boring but important one of looking at e-invoices. So we know that e-invoices are like a digital version of a paper invoice. And when we look at the trade and supply chain, there's so much paperwork across all of that. So you can start to see that I think it's estimated it saves $20 for every invoice as opposed to using a paper invoice. So those savings, as you start to add them up of different businesses using them, are exponential. And we're starting to see that e-invoicing, and particularly the international standard, the e-PEPL, standard being used by Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and it popping up and being a really core part of some of these digital trade enablement. The last one that's good to think about too is AI. So I've sort of said that digital trust underpins everything. And so that's often like access to data. But the other thing that we're seeing that's really enabling digital trade is that discussion on ethics principles as part of that. So we see that in the deeper agreement. And this is really exciting because we can see like all sizes of businesses, government, academia really benefiting from that productivity, the predictiveness, and that sort of personalization of services that AI is offering. And I'm sure we'll come back to this in the questions in the discussion, but really what we're sort of seeing a lot of these agreements doing is providing that rules of the road for going forward. So is in like providing that path and that building blocks for different economies to leverage. A lot of the way that we're seeing that happen is by leveraging those international standards across some of these core areas. And then the key part is sort of to make sure that these digital trade agreements, that we're getting what we want out of them is that measurement piece, because we don't know what we can't measure. You can see that we've got some conservative numbers in the beginning that I've sort of walked through, but it'd be great to be able to see like this is the impact that these digital trade agreements are having on our region, so that we can further double down on them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gan, for the excellent presentations. And now we're going to start the discussion. Actually 10 minutes left, but and many questions coming from the audience. The main point from the questions from the audience is now economic security is high on the agenda in each country, and supply chain management and technological competition are very important for every country. So the key question is the traditional or conventional agreement like FTA and others are sufficient enough to address issues where we are facing in the age of geopolitical tensions in the Asia Pacific. First, I would like to ask Dr. Lili. You mentioned in the Pacific Economic Framework, and the detail is coming soon. So if you can elaborate on that one, that would be appreciated.
Well, this is a difficult issue. It's probably, like the core of the issue. We see security as requiring us to build some people out of the system, and yet the economics say they have to be in the system. So where does this go? I think that in dealing with the US, one thing I think the region can make clear is that economic security is entwined with national security, which is what the US is clearly saying. Then the US, which is offering a security guarantee as part of this package, right? The security issues, national security issues, are also part of the Indo-Pacific framework. They're just not part of the economic framework. I think the region has to stress that an economic framework is also key to the national security issues. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if the US, goes further in terms of being less than helpful in resolving some of the issues of the WTO, or in terms of actually rolling back on some of its market access through anti-dumping, CVD, expanded rules, that just leaves more space for the region to integrate with China. So, I mean, it just goes to, as we've said, markets will seek a new equilibrium, and the chairs will be rearranged. And I think that is something the US doesn't want, but it clearly makes the point that economic security and national security are linked, and therefore you must offer some form of economic progress in the framework to have it be truly meaningful. I'm pretty sure we're not going to see that to the extent that any of us on this panel would like to see, but I think that has to be a message that is continually delivered to Washington.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lili. So I'm going to ask to Dr. Hon. You mentioned the CPTPP, and there is a sort of skepticism if China is sufficiently prepared to meet high standard criteria set out in the TPP, such as state-owned enterprises and digital trade. And do you have any comment on that?
Yes, thank you. And I think, yeah, just I mentioned China's applications for CPTPP is very seriously. Seriously, it means we have a comprehensive assessment for the rules of CPTPP and TPPs. So, and we also assessment how China can comply with these rules. And I think, yeah, it's, some of the rules is challenges for China, but when we apply application for this membership, so we want to change it, these rules to comply with CPTPPs. So I think this is opportunities, and also this is not only for other countries but also for China to reform our systems and also some of the practice, also policies in China, and to comply with CPTPP, also new rules. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hon.
Thank you.
Dr. Yin, Indonesia is chairing the G20 process, and it's going to be very important process in this difficult age. So do you have any perspective on that one to further facilitating cooperation among the global partners in the G20 process?
Indonesia will have three main issues that we would like to raise. That one first is on economic recovery. That will cover the financing, debt restructurings, as well as the exit strategy. The second one, we will focus on the new world economic order. That's going to include the discussions of strengthening multilateral trading systems and financing the digital transformations. The third one, inclusive growth and sustainable development. I think we will focus on the commitments of the implementations of the energy transitions and what will be the best way to have access or increase the access for energy transitions financings. So those three main issues that we would like to highlight in the Indonesia G20.
Thank you very much. To Ms. Gan, you mentioned a very interesting point on cross-border digital payment, and will personal information concerns be a barrier for the cross-border digital trade? That is a question from the audience.
So often it's the cross-border data flows which sort of holds everything up, and some of those localization requirements that are in place. But I think with what we're sort of seeing in ASEAN with some of their privacy principles and the data transfer mechanisms that are being put in place, as well as with the APEC, CPPR, and there's really amending of personal data protection regulations throughout the region to sort of facilitate that transfer. So it is often the stumbling block as in why we sort of see a lot of transactions or and that enablement of payment transactions, which really underpins all of the e-commerce growth, difficult. But isn't it, I think you see increasingly people are understanding that this is vital and are putting in place sort of like equivalency or adequacy to try and get around this. So yes, it's a stumbling block, but there's a lot of momentum into enabling the flow of data.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gan. And now we have maybe 1 minute left, but if audience can stay, Shiro-san, can come back to you after hearing all the panelists' comments. What's your view?
Yeah, thank you very much, Watanabe-san. Look, it's a really rich discussion. We've run out of time, but I was getting a little bit worried that we're all in agreement about all the problems, but nobody was suggesting any way forward. until, of course, Grace gave us some ideas about, this positive story of the huge potential that our digital economies and connecting those digital economies that really don't see any borders when you and don't see distance except for all the artificial ones that we're putting up. And that is the area, the technology area, where decoupling is most acute. So I guess a question for me going forward is on this digital trust issue. This is really where some of the huge gains are. How can we get to a place where Australian or Japanese governments or the community can be assured and comforted by having Chinese companies owning local data assets? Is it a matter of just strong domestic laws and capacity? What kind of regional or multilateral frameworks of rules and norms do we need to make that happen? Because clearly that's going to be where the rubber hits the road. And Mary gave us a summary really of where the US is or isn't, and it is really going to, I take away from Mary's presentation that the United States is going to continue to be a source of uncertainty going forward in the international economy, if not division for this part of the world. And this idea of friend shoring, or I've heard it being called as ally shoring, is really a terrifying idea for me if it actually can be implemented. That was tried in the interwar period between First World War and Second World War. It didn't end too well, leading to a fracture of the global economic system and division. So I think, as Mary said, coming back in the discussion, the importance of emphasizing economic integration, economic security as part of security, and that's not decoupling. And I guess this is where Lili said Australia and Japan should actively try to shape US policies. Well, I think trying to get the United States back into CPTPP or other initiatives, we've seen the limitations of that, of US allies in the region being successful. I would suggest that maybe this is an important time, not just for Australia and Japan, but of course Indonesia, and the importance of Indonesia, which I think, Lili, you might underestimate, or Indonesia might underestimate in this world, because as not just the president of the G20 now, but Indonesia did think up the RCEP idea and did lead the whole RCEP agreement to conclusion. That shouldn't be underestimated given the difficult circumstances. Indonesia is half of ASEAN, roughly, in population and GDP. And of course, chairs the group of 33 developing countries of the WTO. So this is where some leadership from Indonesia would be really important and can create space for the rest of ASEAN and the rest of East Asia, I think, to contribute when it comes to rules and leadership that doesn't just talk about the easy rhetorical stuff, but actually makes strong commitments. And I'll just end on this one last note, Watanabe-san, but on the WTO, I think it's tempting to look at the difficulties there and feel hopeless or give up. And we've all talked about how it needs to be strengthened. This isn't a narrow technical negotiating issue. This is the problem at the WTO. It needs real strategic political intervention. And that's going to come from groups like the G20, but where APEC and other groupings can help build that kind of consensus. And this is where we need countries to show leadership and send signals that the rules matter and the commitment. So as a few of us have touched on, the WTO rules right now are not enforceable because of the US veto of judges to the dispute settlement system's appellate body. But that is no reason to give up, of course. And in fact, a group of countries, members of the WTO, including Australia and China, Singapore, European Union, and 25 others, have created this multi-party interim arbitration, an alternative dispute settlement system that replicates the WTO's. My question here is, Japan is not a member of this. Indonesia is not a member of this. Perhaps it's time that as part of the fix in the WTO's dispute settlement system, as Lili said, that these countries take a leadership role and move towards participation of that with a move to making the rules more enforceable. So that's just one of many issues, but I think an example where leadership really will require effort and leading by example. So I think I've raised more questions than I've answered, but I think we need to continue some of these difficult discussions with our American and Chinese colleagues and try to mobilize some coalitions in the region that really emphasize the importance of economic integration as a source of national security, because that's a story in East Asia that I think we need to keep re-emphasizing. Thanks, Watanabe-san.
Thank you, Shiro-san, for wonderful wrap-up. I think, as you mentioned, you raised many questions, and Mary and Hon and Dr. In may have many responses, but I think with an excellent wrap-up, we're going to close the session. If anyone has any final remark, we're going to close the session. Does anyone? Okay. Thank you very much, Shiro-san and Dr. Lovely and Dr. Hon and Dr. In and Ms. Gang for joining us, and thank you everyone for participating. We had a very good discussion, and thank you again, Shiro-san, and we close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.